Imagine that for some reason you were awake in the early morning of April 26, 1986. You see a huge fireball blast into the air and you have no idea what it is. In fact, you weren't sure what it was until days after the initial accident. This is what it was like as a citizen during the accident of Chernobyl. Chernobyl should be of great relevance to all of you sitting in the audience right now. We are all approximately 1 hour and 53 minutes away from a nuclear plant, which can at any time be just like Chernobyl. Ever since I was in high school, I've been obsessed with historical events and had little knowledge about Chernobyl. It was this year when I truly became obsessed with this tragic disaster. Ever since my obsession with Chernobyl, I've watched numerous documentaries and read lots of articles about Chernobyl. There are many events that happened around it, and I'm going to focus on what led to the explosion, the days after it, and the effects radiation had on people, the environment, and what Chernobyl is like today. I will begin with talking about the events leading up to the nuclear disaster. The first thing we should learn about Chernobyl was how exactly everything happened to cause such a disaster. At 1 o'clock a.m. on April 25th, 1986, the operators working at the nuclear plant began lowering the power on reactor number 4 in preparation for a safety test. At 1 o'clock a.m. the next day, the safety fixtures and emergency systems were turned off. 23 minutes after the systems are shut off, the test begins and they have an unexpected power surge. With this happening, an operator hit the emergency shutdown button, which jammed control rods into the core. 18 seconds after the emergency shutdown button was pressed, the first explosion happened, and was quickly followed by a second. This explosion caused the 1,000-ton roof of the reactor to fly off into the air, causing a bright ball of fire into the sky. After the explosion in the building, smoke and graphite chunks flowed throughout the air, and radiation was present everywhere. The Soviet government decided to shut down the roads so that citizens could not leave or enter later on that morning. The rest of the reactors of the nuclear plant are also turned off. By 6:35 a.m., all the fires that had taken place because of the explosion had been extinguished, except the one in the reactor core. The reactor core burnt for days, and the next day, around 10 a.m., helicopters began dumping things like sand, clay, boron, lead, and dolomite into the core, attempting to slow the emissions of radioactivity. The Soviet government told no one about the accidents that had happened until 36 hours after it happened, and with that, they decided to evacuate Pripyat and the surrounding areas. The next day, April 28th, the world began learning what had happened at Chernobyl because of satellites, air monitors, and other graphs around the world. In the beginning of May, the cleanup of the nuclear accident began. One of the things they did during the cleanup was they pumped liquid nitrogen under the reactor in hopes of cooling it down. Not only did they just pour liquid nitrogen over the reactor, they also had to kill animals that had been exposed to radioactivity and bury gobs of contaminated topsoil. On May 6, the emissions finally dropped, and 3 days later, concrete was laid under the reactor to prevent any more radiation from sinking into the ground. This was known as the sarcophagus. Finally, on May 14th, Gorbachev spoke publicly about Chernobyl and what had happened. According to the officially internationally recognized death toll, just 31 people died as an immediate result of Chernobyl. Now that we have focused on the events leading up to Chernobyl, the disaster itself, and the days after, we will look at the effects radioactivity had on people and the environment. Not only were people affected by the nuclear fallout, but so were the animals and the environment. In an article by the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission, it said that the total number of thyroid cancer registered in the 1991 to 2015 period among those under 18 years of age in 1986 approached 20,000. 5,000 of these cases were because of radioactive iodine. While not everyone was close enough to the initial explosion to be diagnosed with ARS, I'm still going to touch on what that was and how it affected people. ARS stands for acute radiation sickness. Radiation sickness symptoms can include hair loss, fever, bloody vomit and stool from the radioactive waves, internal bleeding, and it also had horrible effects on your skin. According to the Mayo Clinic, we can see how bad the radiation affected people. When Valery Gazov, a Soviet chemist who was the chief of commission investigating Chernobyl disaster, discussed in his tapes the heartbreaks of Chernobyl. He later committed suicide. Animals that were contaminated because of radiation were killed, and the ones that weren't killed suffered horrible mutations, just like this horse. The environment was also affected by radiation. The trees wilted and plants suffered mutations, and they were not suitable for anyone to eat. The top layer of soil also had to be buried because of radiation. It is said that Chernobyl will not be habitable for another 20,000 years. While Chernobyl is not habitable again, many tourists like to go and visit the nuclear plant and take guided tours through Pripyat. There are also many people who live and work around Chernobyl to this day. The reactor that exploded caused the nuclear accident was covered in 2016 by a steel barrier to support the decaying sarcophagus. Now that we have learned about the Chernobyl disaster, we should be more informed on the logistics of the disaster. Chernobyl was a nuclear disaster that happened on April 26, 1986, that caused a lot of death and disease and had effects on not only people but also the environment. Chernobyl is now a tourist spot, and many people enjoy learning about the tragic events. So far, none of us in this room have been personally affected by a nuclear disaster, but we need to cross our fingers that we never are.